introduction, then here we are. Welcome, welcome. My name is Sarah Holliday, the library's head of events, and I'm very pleased to have you all here in the members' room of the New York Society Library and those joining us coming to the members' room from afar. As we begin, we acknowledge that the library stands on traditional lands of the Lenape people and other indigenous peoples to whom we pay respect. We're pleased to be able to offer a vibrant season of events with authors like tonight's event. Major events are generally open to the public, so please take a look at our website or speak to a staff member to learn more about what's coming up. I also want to let you know that we are live streaming and recording tonight's event, as well as taking photographs. I'm pleased to welcome Robert E. Rubin and David Litt to the members' room. We're happy to have David Litt back in the room after his presentation in our humor evening Uptown at Night in 2019. A former presidential speechwriter, he's the New York Times best-selling author of Thanks, Obama, My Hopey-Changey White House Years, and Democracy in One Book or Less. Robert E. Rubin served as the 70th U.S. Treasury Secretary from 1995 to 1999, after serving as the first director of the White House National Economic Council. He is the author of In an Uncertain World, Tough Choices from Wall Street to Washington, a New York Times bestseller. He has also had senior roles at Goldman Sachs and Citigroup, and is a founder of the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution, which promotes broad-based economic growth. Tonight, of course, he'll be speaking about his newest book, The Yellow Pad. Speaking of that, we have copies of The Yellow Pad for sale by our friends from the Corner Bookstore just outside this room, and the link to purchase books from them online is in the live stream chat. Exactly. Also, we do want to make sure to include some substantial question and answer and conversation with the audience, so please keep your questions and comments in mind throughout the presentation. Please enjoy this conversation between David Litt and Robert E. Rubin.
Well, thank you, everybody. And first of all, I should say I totally forgot to ask you whether we were wearing ties this evening.
But apparently not we.
But yeah, half of us are wearing ties. And in the book, you talk about being willing to work with someone who was not even wearing socks or shoes on the trading floor at Goldman Sachs. So at least I have both socks and shoes tonight.
Shoes, they're sneakers.
That is actually, I think they're sock trainers, is what they said on the website. So I'm sure everyone here has read The Yellow Pad cover to cover, and bought several copies for their family and friends and all of that. But just for those of you who either haven't read it or haven't read it, recently, Bob, I wanted to start by where I think this book really started for you, which is in a college philosophy class. With a professor who really shaped your life. So can you sort of tell the room about Raphael Demos and the effect that he had on you?
Sure. Some people sometimes, I do a certain amount of speaking, one thing or another, and people sometimes ask me, what course best prepared you for life at Goldman Sachs, life at Treasury, et cetera, thinking I'm going to say something about a finance course. I did major in economics, thinking I'm going to say something about a finance course, and it wasn't that at all. In my sophomore year, I took a course called Philosophy 1 by Raphael Demos at Harvard. And we sat there, and he took us through the great speakers of the ages, the great thinkers of the ages, rather. And I didn't understand how a lot was going on. I did get an A in the course, but in any event. But I really didn't understand a lot of what was going on. But after a while, I began to realize that there was something else happening here. And the other thing that was happening is that Professor Demos was trying to lead us to recognize that there were no provable certainties. And that, David, I just related to for some reason. And later on my own, I extrapolated from that to the view that if there are no provable certainties, then all decisions are about probabilities or odds, probabilities. And that, David, that notion that all decisions about probabilities shaped everything I've ever done pretty much, whether Treasury or Goldman Sachs, as you said, later on, everything else I've done.
Well, so
investing, management, in all of that activity.
So why don't we sort of talk about that a little bit more. So obviously the book is called The Yellow Pad, and the Yellow Pad is a sort of manifestation of this probabilistic decision making that you originally learned from Demos or began to think about from Demos.
No, actually it's interesting, David, because well, at least interesting to me. What he gave me was intellectual framework. I think it accorded with my psyche, actually. I think I had a psyche that's sort of built that way. But then I sort of extrapolated from that to this view that all decisions are about. Okay.
And so explain how the Yellow Pad played a role in that extrapolation.
Yeah, and then as time went on, I guess it probably was when I went to law school, and I went to Clear Gottlieb in Hamilton, which is one wonderful firm for me because it was sort of low pressure. Well, low pressure, it was lower pressure than some of the others. And we used to use yellow pads. And I recognized I could take my yellow pad and I could have this issue to deal with, David. I could write down the various considerations, the possibilities of a decision, whatever it might be. And then I could put down what my judgment was as to what the probabilities were of these various effects that the decision could have materializing, and then eventually decide what was the best cost-benefit decision to make. And what you could do is you could take an issue, whatever it was, and you could say, okay, I'll make this decision. What are the various possible effects? And then what are the odds of those materializing? And then use, some of you know about expected value, but that's just taking it all together and deciding what the net effect would be. And then you could do that with a bunch of different possible decisions on a given issue and decide which was the best decision. And so the yellow pad became the instrument for me of effectuating, if you will, this probabilistic mindset.
So I should say, when I think about anything that I work with someone else on, speech, what have you, I'm always asking myself, what did I learn? Because I get to be kind of the stand-in for a reader, for an audience. And so I will sort of briefly advertise this book and say I learned, the last, when did we start on this one?
I would say this book probably took us 4.5 years, David.
Yeah.
It was a long time.
So that's a very long time, and I've learned an enormous amount in that time. And so just a few of the things that we won't get to cover, at least not completely this evening. First of all, about decision making, which I think is the overarching theme of the book, or an overarching theme of the book, but also, everything from criminal justice to fiscal policy, the concept of applied existentialism, managing people. So lots of things that are in here that mean this. We can't cover everything in one conversation. Because of the nature of the work that we've done together, what I wanted to do tonight, and also because of where we are in a place that really loves books, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the process and about the process of writing a book and thinking about a book. So the first time we met, I believe, or the first time we discussed this, you said to me that what you really wanted to do more than anything else was go on an intellectual journey. That was the phrase you used. And so I'm curious, first of all, what do you mean by that? And then second of all, what did you, and I don't think I know what your answer is going to be. What did you, what happened on the intellectual journey? What do you think about differently now than when we started?
Good lawyer never asks the question if they don't know the answer in any event.
I'm not a lawyer.
No, but you are good. David, I guess I've said about 5-6 years ago, whenever it was, I don't remember. I was thinking to myself that I've been through a fair bit in life, and I wanted to reflect on all that, but not to look backwards, to look forwards. And then I thought I'd like to write a book. And it started with thinking that I would write about various policy issues that interested me, fiscal policy, climate change, whatever. But I also at the same time wanted to write, and the book is, by the way, does have that. There's one chapter on investing, there's one on climate change, et cetera. But then I also wanted to write on this underlying theme of uncertainty, complexity, and probabilistic decision making. And so out of that, I started making some notes, and then I luckily met you. Actually, I started with somebody else, and it was terrific. But you were a little cheaper. The other guy actually really was a terrific guy. He's fairly well known, but it wouldn't have worked. And we did work, and we just worked our way through this. And so very often what happens is I would take an issue, you mentioned we have applied existentialism, but that is basically how do you deal with stress and how do you deal with things that go wrong, because they very often do go wrong psychologically. At least how do I think you should deal with this so you keep yourself going along. And so I would make some notes or whatever it might be, and then you and Megan Prunty, who's here someplace, who worked with us. Megan was in the White House with us. She worked on my first book. Now she does a whole bunch of things, but she helped us with this book. And Charlie Landau, who was at that time my chief of staff, the four of us would sat and we would talk it out almost like a seminar, and we would try to think it through. And then eventually we would prepare a draft. And the draft would go back and forth, and I think we drove. But when we got toward the end of the process, and we were dealing with an editor, I think we actually drove them nuts. No, but I care what words mean, and I really do. And we were very careful about nuance and well, there are different ways to interpret what was being said, and we want to make sure the interpretation that we had on it got across. And out of that came this book.
So I do want to ask you about driving editors.
I captured that our process.
Yeah, I think that's right. But actually, I want to ask you something before that, which is you had mentioned that we did this often, conversations with 4 people, sometimes more. You know,
we would
Jake Weisberg was
Oh, yeah,
involved.
and also if there were issues that involved expertise of others, we would reach out and interview them or talk to them or meet with them or whatever it might be. So we drew in a lot of people outside of our own little group.
So I will admit, when we started that, I was very, very skeptical that it would work particularly well, because the idea of writing something, you know, with 5 people all working on it, you normally, you know, what do they say? A camel is a horse designed by committee, right? So, which is really anti-camel, but that's but it's interesting. I mean, you write about this in the book throughout your career in politics, in government, at Goldman Sachs, and as an investor. You've really relied on groups. How are you, or how have you been able to work with groups in a way that does not become sort of by committee?
Let me give you a good example, David. When we were Treasury, I was secretary and Larry Summers was deputy. Tim Geithner was, I guess at that point he was assistant secretary for international economic stuff, whatever that was called. And then we had several other really very capable people. So we would sit down and we would go over whatever we're going to do and talk it out. And then once every week, Larry and I would go over to the Fed and we'd have breakfast with Alan Greenspan. And eventually Alan wanted to be part of our little group. So if we were going to discuss something that we thought was relevant to Alan, like the Mexican financial crisis or whatever it was, sometimes we go to the Fed, but usually he'd come to Treasury. And he said it was like coming to a graduate seminar, because we really did. We just sat there and exchanged views. We didn't let our egos get in the way, and some of these people had a certain amount of ego. But we didn't let them get in the way. And it was a terrific process. Now, ultimately, I was the Secretary of Treasury, so I had to make a decision. Or if it involved the Fed, then Alan and I would do it. Non-interest rate, that would be always respecting the bench of the Fed. But everything else, Alan and I would do it together. With Larry, the 3 of us did it mostly, and then Tim was very involved in a slightly less senior way. And that was how it worked. So we got the benefit of a lot of different people. And we'd sometimes invite people we knew had different views than we did, David. But if we all kind of thought we were probably about here on something, we would try to identify somebody, or we would identify somebody who we're pretty confident would have a different view, but thoughtfully differently, and invite them. And I'll tell you, when you have people who don't agree with you, President Clinton used to say this. He said, I never want to sit and make a decision unless there's somebody in the room who will tell me what the opposite is of what I think is right. Now, maybe I'll never agree with them, or I won't agree with them sometime, or I will agree with them, whatever. But whatever it is, I want to test my thoughts against the converse. He was a terrific decision maker, against the converse view. And that's what we did at Treasury, David. And then I said, Alan, at some point, started coming over, and he said, I like being here. It's like a graduate seminar.
Well, it's interesting in that seminar context, because I think one of the other things that I had to learn very quickly when we started working together, I think Megan called me up at some point and explained that, when Bob says that he wants to hear what you have to say if you disagree with him, he actually means it. And that's not typical, right? I mean, most people really want to hear your honest opinion, as long as it is exactly the same as their opinion. And so, but I some of it I think you would say is how you're wired and your psyche. But for those of us who may have different psyches or are wired however we're wired, what are ways to encourage that kind of healthy disagreement at a time when that seems particularly in every context? I mean, it just seems harder to do.
I think there's a tremendous chilling effect now, David. I really do. I think we've lost the sense of discourse across differing views, and I think it's a terrible, in our political system, to some extent, well, maybe to a fair extent, in our universities. President-elect Clinton, Governor Clinton, President-elect Clinton, in January of '93, before we actually got into office, remember you got in, inauguration was the 22nd or whatever, I don't remember. He got us all back and got the economic team down to Little Rock, and he looked at us and he said, you've got to tell me what you really think, but if you don't, I'm dead. And he really and truly, what he emphasized, what he strongly articulated was an expectation that we would disagree when we disagreed. And even if we didn't disagree, we would try to identify the contrary points of view. And I think you've got to create an atmosphere like that, David. And I think today, unfortunately, with all of what I at least think is unduly sensitive reaction to all kinds of things, I think it's harder to do probably than it would be ordinarily.
So there's a different kind of debate as well that I think took place within the book and in the process of the book. Not just people with differing opinions or saying or trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, but also I would say, and this gets to the driving editors crazy part of the conversation. I never worked on something where we really interrogated every word quite so thoroughly As some people may have even gotten exasperated at times. I won't name names.
But at least one of the two of them are here.
Yes, there's that. But I think the number of cases, if you read the book, where you'll see something described as highly probable as opposed to extremely probable, and that usually reflects a discussion one way or the other. So Bob, something you've told me is that kind of precision, but also writing things down, really helps you as a decision maker, not just as a writer, but also in all the different spheres that you've been involved in. Tell me a little bit more about how that has guided you or
No,
made
I think that's right, David. I think this is my view at least. I think if you're trying to think something through, this, as I say, is at least me, and I don't know whether it's more broadly felt or not. I think when you try to write something down, you're forced to be more disciplined. And I've always been, by the way, very focused on what the words mean. And nuance matters. And moderation matters. And people will say things, very often people say things in ways that don't reflect the complexity and uncertainty that's involved. And so in the book someplace we say, and I met with the CEO this afternoon, of a company that we hopefully will do business with, but we'll see. But one thing he said, I read your book, I really liked it, and I like the idea of taking probabilistic comments, and that itself is writing down, but then trying to attach a number to it. It's not because you believe that recession is a 65% probability as opposed to 55, but that is a good percentage difference, but in any event, but putting a number on it makes it more precise. And I've always tried to do that, David, recognizing that the number itself is not the important thing as such, but what does it captures sort of your rough sense of what the probabilities are.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, actually, that when you're saying
And people say, somebody said to me the other day, a very sophisticated guy, said, I think it's probably going to have a recession. I said, okay, but it's probably mean 55% or 85%. Well, those are two different thoughts.
Yeah, very much so. And I think there's an interesting anecdote in the book about, I don't even remember who this is about, and I wouldn't say if I did, but somebody who says there's a 55% chance of anything happening. And that way, if he's right, he can say, well,
I know exactly who it was. It was one of the senior people at Goldman Sachs. I was chairing the compensation committee, and I was saying to him at some point, how come you never seem to be wrong? He said, because I never am wrong. I always say 55% chance of this, and so inevitably I'm right. Yeah, I know exactly who it is.
But something that I think is really interesting, and certainly something that I learned as we were working on this book together, is that this idea of probability, there's a lot of numbers involved, but it's really not technocratic. I mean, I think Bob, I think this is, I don't even know if you'll take this as a compliment or an insult, but I think it's surprisingly human. There's not, it's not.
What you mean by that?
Yeah, that's, well, what I mean by that really is that this is not, it's not cold, right? That the numbers are about trying to solve problems that cannot be really solved with numbers and are not tangible. So can you talk a little bit about that, particularly in the context of policy and?
Yeah, but I think one of the complexities, which your comment just leads into, David, is that some considerations you can try to you can kind of quantify. Other things you just can't. How do you quantify a clean stream? And yet it's a really important characteristic. And so we say in the book that when you identify all the factors that you think, or let's say the possible effects of a decision, some of them are quantifiable, or at least in some rough way, like we were just talking about, David. And some of them you really can't. A clean stream, what does it mean? What does human life mean? Now, Michael Greenstone, who used to be at MIT, now at the University of Chicago, told me that economists actually have tried to calculate what a human life is worth. Well, okay. But I said to Mike, I'm not sure that totally captured the idea. But in any event, I think you still have, even the fact that it's not quantifiable doesn't mean it's not real. And so you have to just factor those things in, David.
Yeah, I think that idea, that exactly what you just said, but I'm going to repeat it because to me it's one of the things that really stuck with me in the book, that just because something's quantifiable doesn't mean it's not real. It's something that I've thought a lot about sort of in general since hearing it from you for the first time. So I'm going to ask a very different question for a moment. It gets a little bit more into the different issues that you talk about in the book. One of them is fiscal policy, and you felt it was important to address fiscal policy. And I don't remember what we say That's the part you can skip, or how do we describe this?
No, my wife Judy said that that's the one chapter that wasn't interesting. She said you should put a little banner at the top of it saying you can skip this chapter. So I think we actually did start that chapter off by saying, if you don't like this, go to the next chapter.
And I think that's a good disclaimer for many people who might not find fiscal policy.
I personally find
thrilling.
fiscal policy absolutely
Well, so that's my
fascinating.
question.
I really do. Somebody once said to me, "You're the only person I've ever met who gets passionate about fiscal policy."
So I've known you for a little while, and I've known that you're, for some reason, passionate about fiscal policy, but I've never asked you why. What convert the rest of us to fiscal policy?
I think it's fundamental. Okay, well, I'm not going to convert you, David, but I'll tell you this. I think it's foundational to what's going to happen to our economy and therefore what happens to our society more broadly. I think we are in an unholy mess right now. If you look at our fiscal trajectory, the CB, I'm going to get technical, just going to be 1 minute since I happen to be consumed by this. The CBO projects that our debt to GDP ratio go from roughly 100, which it is now, to roughly 118 10 years from now. The people I know people I know who really are seriously thoughtful about this think they vastly underestimate what's going to happen unless we change trajectories. And I talked today with Joe Stiglitz and Peter Orszag about that. And how should one try to think about this? I think it's a tremendous risk to our society, to our economy, and our society, David. But why do I feel that way? I don't know. I remember when Ted Kennedy was running for president. It was 1982. Remember those 84 elections? I guess it was 82. And I went to a speech he gave, and I thought, gee, this guy's touching every base that I believe in. Overcoming poverty, inequality, not so much inequality at that point, but overcoming poverty and helping people displaced and everything. And I thought, this is what I'm going to work on this campaign. And then he was finished. And I thought, wait a minute, how are you going to pay for all this stuff? I said to myself, and then I called the people of the Mondale campaign and said, I'll work in your campaign. I guess I've had that orientation, whatever the reason may be, David, for a long, long time. But I think, unfortunately, we are in a trajectory that is deeply dangerous for our country. And you're now seeing more manifestations of that. I mean, when interest rates were very low, nobody really cared, but now long minus 5%, people care.
So I have a different question. This is less process oriented in the book, but more about since the book came out, which I think is what was in June. So it's interesting. The book's been in the world a little bit.
May 16th.
It was May 16th, but who's counting? But so I guess the thing that I'm wondering is, have you? I think a book means something different once it exists for other people, right? So has the intellectual journey aspect of it changed as you've talked to people who have encountered it?
That's a good question, David. When we started and I talked about intellectual journey, I knew what I was hoping we would do, and we really did do it. That by writing, something you said before, David, goes back to something you said, that by actually thinking this through and writing down and then calling other people, both within our little group and elsewhere, I think I expanded and improved and fleshed out my own thinking on a lot of subjects. I really do. I don't know since it's come out. I guess the one thing that has struck me since it's come out, an awful lot of people have said things to me about it. And I think this idea of trying to think more rigorously and more probabilistically sort of registered with people, but I think this manifested in a way and reflected in a way that they maybe hadn't thought through thoroughly. But not in any particular. I don't think so, David.
So one other thing I want to ask you about, even though it's really very much covered in the book, I think it comes up so often in the different aspects of your life and your career. Even in our conversation today, I think early on this evening, you said when we were at Treasury, right? And I think many people in your position have said when I was running Treasury or something similar. And
Larry would say he was running Treasury.
So, and another I've heard that phrase. I think Larry told me that Bob said you work for the people who work for you. Which hearing you say that might mean something different when Larry's saying that. Anyway, but the point being, so tell me about that approach.
You do work for the people who work for you, and the failing to recognize that, I think, gets an awful lot of people in a lot of trouble. Really, David.
So how did you come to learn that yourself, and did your own approach as a manager wrote
exactly how it happened. I was at Goldman Sachs, and I went there to in the risk arbitrage department, something I knew absolutely nothing about. But I was clear about I wanted to go into the financial world. I sent out my resume all over the place because I had a pretty good resume coming out of college, and I got 0 job offers. So that approach wasn't working very well. So then I met somebody who knew somebody, and eventually I got an offer at Goldman Sachs, something called arbitrage, which I'd never heard of. And I didn't know what the hell I was doing. But it turned out it was very well suited to my temperament. It's a probabilistic business. And I guess, David, out of that, I think that's right. Out of that, so it just came a whole, I developed this view about probability decision making before that, but I think out of that came out just a realization how to use this approach to everything I did. And that's kind of where it all came from. It started with Demos. It got seriously refined and made more precise and more disciplined running a risk arbitrage environment because the risks were enormous. And then at each stage of my life, I think, David, sort of added something to it. I'll never forget when Larry and I went to see President Clinton in January of 1995, and he had just gotten killed in the midterms. You'll probably remember that. And we said to him, Mr. President, I know the politics of this are terrible, but Mexico is facing a dire crisis. And if we don't deal with it, it may create terrible problems here. And we went through all this. And he said, well, you're telling me that we should do it, but you're telling me we can't be sure it's going to work. And we said, that's absolutely right. He was thinking probabilistically, David. Mm-hmm. Whether he thought about it that way himself or not, but he absolutely was thinking probabilistically.
Well, it's interesting because in the book, you say the opposite.
I want to go back to the question you asked me. But when I was sitting in the arbitrage department, we were a central part of the firm's profitability. And I was pretty harsh with people. It really was, David. And if they come to ask me a question, I'd say, that's sort of dumb. It's not a good way to deal with people. And then the partner running the risk arbitrage area left, so I was put in charge of it. And Ray Young, a senior partner, not the senior partner, a senior partner of the firm, came to see me and he said, you deal with people in a very difficult way. You have two choices at this point in your life. You can continue doing that and run the arbitrage firm and you'll make very good money. Or you can start to worry about their concerns, their interests, how to make them more successful, in which case you'd have a much bigger role in the firm. David, it didn't take one, I guess, I don't know if most people have this in their life or not. For me, it was an instant reaction to it. And I just changed the way I functioned. And that then got me focusing on management and how to want to manage. And I found management in and of itself intriguing, not the right word, it's a captivating sort of an issue.
Would you say that's the best piece of advice you've ever gotten, or is there anything rival that in terms of usefulness throughout your life?
Well, I'll say this: it was very useful. I'd have to think about that a little bit, but it was certainly that piece of advice. Yeah, it was probably about as.
I mean, that seems like a pretty good one. I'm not trying to.
Yeah, it was a very good one. I mean, Gus Levy, our senior partner. Anybody here remember his name? Yeah, not many, well, a few. Gus was the senior partner at Goldman Sachs. He was a major figure in Wall Street and Republican politics. And I remember, never forget Gus telling me, don't assume anything. And that mindset, that actually we didn't do enough of in the book, I don't think, David. That sort of questioning mindset, not assuming anything, being constructively skeptical, looking under the hood. I think that probably was, again, psychologically the way I was built, but I think Gus saying that somehow registered with me.
Yeah, you have an interesting, I'm not even sure if it made it into the book, because there's a lot of stuff that made it into the book. But you talk about you and Larry being in a meeting and in the White House, and that sense of looking under the hood.
Yeah, I remember that. John Podesta was chief of staff. What was Erskine? No, it was John. Anyway, one or the other. There was a chief of, it was John. It was chief of staff, and he passed out some papers to everybody with numbers. And so they all sat there and they discussed it. But Larry and I asked questions instead of having opinions. And we laughed. I said to Larry, I don't understand. When we were questioning what these numbers meant, and everybody else was to take the numbers as stated, and then as fait accompli, if you will. It's the wrong word probably, but taking the numbers as stated and just going on to think from there. And he said, that's right. He said, most people don't look under the hood. And we really did.
So I know we want to get to audience questions at some point. Sarah, whenever that point is, feel free to wave unsubtly in my direction. But one thing I want to make sure we talk about before then, and I don't think we got to this nearly enough in the book, is fly fishing. Because I feel like that's been something that has been, in addition to investing and government and public policy, I think the only thing that rivals that in terms of your interests is fly fishing, as far as I can.
Judy and my family.
Right. Outside of that. And so the question.
Your popularity rating just went down to some quarter. Go ahead.
So the question that I had, though, was, I mean, you've been fly fishing for a very long time. What has it taught you?
It's a strange thing about fly fishing. Judy and I were going down to the Bahamas. I was exhausted, and I said, let's get out of here for a few days. And I took a spinning rod with me. I don't know how many of you fishermen, so maybe all this doesn't mean too much, but it's a different kind of a rod. And and I saw somebody using something different, and I said to the guy, what's that? He said, it's called a fly rod. So I said, okay, let me try that. That's 40 years ago, David. I've never fished anything else since then, and I've become consumed by fly fishing. I love it. You're on the water. Casting is an art form, like playing golf or playing tennis. You have to relate to the environment. I don't mean in an environmental sense, but you have to know where the fish might be, what might they react to. And all I can tell you is it's sort of a Zen kind of a thing. But if I get on the water at 8 o'clock, I don't get up that early because I'm kind of lazy. But if I get on the water by 9 or 9:30, I remember the time I was going with Hank Paulson someplace. And at 6, Hank said, I'm going to get up at 6. I said, Hank, why are you getting up at 6? He said, I want to catch more fish than anybody else. I said, okay. Hank, I don't care about that. I just want to be able to sleep. But I want to sleep. But anyway, no, Hank's very good. Hank is intense. In any event, you get on the water at 9 o'clock and you get off at 4:30, say, or something. The time, you don't know it's happened, at least for me.
Well, and I think, an extra hour of sleep is one of those things that the value can't really be quantified. So, and so I want to run through a couple of quick questions before we turn things over to the group. So what is, looking back and I know, what's something that has really surprised you most in life? What's something that you believe now that you that you really can't imagine you would have believed if you'd asked this question 58 years ago?
I think our society is falling apart. I know, I really do. I'm serious. I'm not joking. I think our political system is falling apart. Our societal order is falling apart. Our sense of national purpose. There was a poll of something recently. Well, I heard about it recently. Maybe it's not so recent, but relatively recently. In 1998, if I remember this correctly, 70% of the American people thought that patriotism was an important value for them. Today's number at the end of 2022, I know I heard this from now, 32%. I mean, our society is in trouble. I think we'll come back as we always have. So that's one thing. Look, I never thought, when Al Gore first told me about climate change, we were in the Oval Office, and he was talking to the president. I was there, as Treasury Executive. And when we were finished, I said to Gore, I said, well, that's, it sounds really bad, but that's way down in the future. He said, come walk down with me. We walked down the hall to the vice president's ceremonial office. And he sat with me, and by the time I left that office, I had changed my mind about climate change. And similarly, inequality, I always felt that the economy has to work for everybody if it's going to be sustainable politically and economically. But I always thought inequality per se didn't matter. And then Heather Boucher, now in the administration, but at that time she was with a think tank, Heather came to see me and she said, no, you're wrong. I said, well, I'm not wrong, Heather, I'm right. And she said, well, here's why inequality per se matters. And I changed my mind, David.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and those are two examples, but there's some others in the book as well, where you really talk about changing your mind, and I think some people, who have had the kind of roles that you've had would see that as a sign of weakness, and I think you see it the opposite way.
I think two things. I think changing your mind is a sign of, at least you've given thought to it. You may be right, you may be wrong. I'll tell you another thing that people think, and then George Stephanopoulos said to me the other day, I haven't seen him in years actually, then we had lunch. I think luck played a major role in my life. I mean, I think there are other qualities and so forth, but I do think luck made a major role. And I think most people, probably almost all people, have been, in some external sense, very successful. I'm not talking about feeling one with yourself. That's another kind of success, which maybe is more important, but more important and harder to attain, I suspect. But George said he felt he'd been very lucky. And I said, George, I felt the same way. It's in my book. He said, a lot of people don't want to they don't want to recognize the role of luck in their lives because they think that diminishes them in some way. And he said, I totally agree with him. He said, it doesn't diminish you. It just means that you're being more realistic.
Well, it seems like it's good times any to turn things over to all of you if you have questions.
Thank you so much for that really insightful, wonderful talk. You discussed being influenced in class about probability and about the seminar-like environment at some of your meetings at Treasury and about conferring recently with Professor Steve Litt at Columbia. I wonder how you feel about how economics are taught today on college campuses. For example, is there enough emphasis on the environment? Is there enough emphasis on international issues? What would be your wisdom on this?
I don't have that much conversance right now. Occasionally I speak at some college or university, but not often. I don't have that much conversance with how it's taught, but I do think that there's probably much more focus today than there used to be on externalities, that is to say, on things like climate change, which aren't captured by companies as they make their profit and loss calculations, but nevertheless matter a great deal to our society. So my guess is that in that sense it's improved. But in another sense, which I'm very familiar with, I think it's more questionable whether what's happened is good or bad. It's become very, very mathematical. And when I majored in economics, it was very conceptual. And I think I came away from that. I don't have any advanced degree in economics, but I came away with an understanding of the concepts, and it's enabled me to engage with people ever since in what I think is a reasonably, at least in my opinion, reasonably thoughtful kind of way. Whereas today, but now for many years, it's been taught in a very mathematical way. And I think, and I deal enough with I actually deal a fair bit with young people, either politically or at our firm, who have gone through this experience. It seems to me that very often their conceptual grasp is not as good as the grasp they would have had if they were educated my way. Even though they can do models and regressions and all kinds of stuff, I wouldn't know how to deal with.
Hey, thank you, first of all, for your dedication to the country, the betterment of the country. I'm curious, I've gotten a little desensitized to fiscal situation. So could you speak to when, what are the catalysts for it actually mattering and how will it matter?
That's a really important question because for a long time, people would say to people like me or Peter Orszag or others who care enormously about these issues, that you keep saying they're a problem and yet nothing's happening. Then about a year ago, or some of you know better than I think roughly a year ago, all of a sudden the long bond interest rate went from roughly maybe I'm wrong by a year, maybe it's a year and a half, I don't remember, but from 1% to 5%. And now that Jim Tankersley, the New York Times told me the other day, now people are talking a lot about it. So I think the increase in interest rates is one important factor that has focused people's attention. But I'll tell you another thing, the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, German bonds and Greek debt were roughly speaking the same interest rate, not quite, but almost, even though Greece would obviously have been massively worse. And that went on for years and years. And people used to say it doesn't make any sense. And all of a sudden, you had a crisis in Greece that shook the sovereign debt world. And so the fact that something hadn't happened for a long time shouldn't give you too much reassurance about the probabilities of it happening at some point. And now, with the interest rate on the long bond going from 5 to 1, Jim told me that Tankersley, 1 to 5 rather, that there's all of a sudden a new awareness. In fact, I saw Larry Summers get out the other day saying he thinks this is the worst fiscal situation in the history of the country. I haven't called Larry yet, but I'm going to remind him that 2 years ago, he and Jason Furman wrote a book, maybe 3 weeks ago, in Foreign Affairs saying, don't worry about fiscal matters. I think he has changed his mind somewhat.
I just want to quickly follow up on that to say for progressives or self-identified progressives, why should they care about these fiscal issues?
They should care enormously, David, because if we don't have a successful economy, then the people that they care about are going to suffer worst. And I don't think we can have a successful economy over time, not in any given moment, but over time, without a sound fiscal trajectory. Secondly, if you're progressive and you believe we should invest in all kinds of, which I do believe, I don't think of myself as progressive, but I do believe we should invest in all kinds of programs to help people get displaced by trade and technology. I think we should have social safety nets that are better than they are. We should have a healthcare system that basically is a function of reform, so to say. But you're not going to have the resources to pay for it if you don't have a better fiscal policy. And what's happening right now is interest as a percentage of our budget is going way the hell up for obvious reasons, because rates are up plus there's increase in debt. I think progressives should be enormously focused on our fiscal position.
Excuse me, you had indicated earlier that you felt the economy was going in the wrong direction, or the country was going in the wrong direction, but you also indicated that you felt it was going to turn around. Could you give us a probability?
Well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. That I thought the country, I'll keep, yeah, that's okay. Let me tell you what I think. I've stayed pretty involved politically, so I see a fair number of people who are involved, as analysts or pollsters or whatever. And I would say that but then I'll go exactly to your question. The predominance of them think, certainly most of them think, most of them think that if you say that in terms of the 2024 election, that who the hell knows what's going to happen is the best answer. But then you say, no, that's no good. tell me what do you think the probabilities are? Most of them, and maybe even predominantly, they think Trump is likely to win. I don't. And I think, and also they would say that our political system, which certainly is in shambles at the moment. I mean, look what's happening in the House of Representatives. But it goes way beyond what's happening now in the House. I kind of think we're going to come back out, but I guess I would say that intellectually, I think the probabilities are very troubling. But then psychologically, and maybe it's just my psyche. So I would say the odds, so I'm going to stick with my psyche at the moment. I think we will come back out, because we always have. We're a dynamic society. We did a civil war once, leaving that aside. We've always come out of it. We have a dynamic society. Politics can change very rapidly in America. But having said that, I do agree with what I said in the book. Or if I didn't say it in the book, I should have. I know I said it in an op-ed I wrote. That these times are probably as uncertain, as complex as any in my adult lifetime. You know, except for episodes, I mean, 62 Cuban Missile Crisis or something, but except for the specific moments. And I think that is very, very troubling. So I guess the way I'd respond to that is say, I think the uncertainty and complexity is greater than any time in my adult lifetime, with the exception of these individual episodes. And that should make you very cautious no matter what the hell you're doing, investing or running a business or whatever. I think intellectually, if you put it all on a yellow pad, I sort of agree with most of the people, in fact, predominantly people I know who are involved politically, to say that the odds seem like they favor a continuation of dysfunction and an election of Trump. But whatever set of reasons, my instinct is that neither one of that's where it's going to happen, but that's maybe more my psyche than anything else.
I'd like to have you react to the proposition, which is that the greatest damage that can come from decision making is not whether you've assigned the probabilities accurately, whether or not you've been comprehensive about seeing all the possible avenues, but really, probability is something multiplied. And so what is it multiplied? It's the value that you're assigning to its elements. Not the percentage likelihood, but the value. So what is your objective? What are you trying to achieve?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And Drew Faust, who used to be president of Harvard, said to me once when he was talking about my book, which is sort of your point, I guess, that where does morality fit into this? And I think the answer to that is twofold. One, you can assign probabilities to different value propositions. In other words, you can say, okay, we're going to make this decision, and we think it's going to have a terrible effect on poor people. And you can say, okay, how do we want to sort of represent that in our calculations? Or you might say, as I said at one point, you could certainly make a statement saying that's going to affect our economy X, Y, Z. But then you could say there's also what you're saying. There's a moral value dimension to that. And so how do you weigh that in? And I think that was Drew's point, which is that there are these non-quantifiable things. In her case, it was morality that can enter into decisions. Secondly, you can solve for things. In other words, you can say, I have a moral judgment that doing something about poverty in America, aside from the fact that it will be important for our economy, for all of us, which I think it will, or if we solve it, and will hurt us if we don't. You can also say that I want to solve for it because I believe there's a morality issue here. And so you can make that your objective, and then you can say, okay, I'm going to make these decisions, and what effect do I think will have on poverty? And then decide which of the various decisions you are considering will best meet your objective. But you're right, injecting value and morality, if that's what you're saying, I think it is.
Yeah, morality is a weighted word, but
It's a weighted word. It's not a word I would ordinarily use because I kind of have a relativistic view of morality, but that's a different question.
just to give you a feeling for where I'm coming from, the fiscal crisis you speak of is, to my mind, a misplaced allocation of value. Because if we're spending so much money and borrowing, so much money occurring.
So much money what?
I'm sorry. What I'm trying to get at is that the fiscal situation we're in is precisely a misallocation of value judgments. Because people are trying to achieve certain things in the present, and they're not willing to understand that by over borrowing, you said our society. It's on our society that we're in our, it's our children's society and our grandchildren's. And so you have to have that, but they're not represented, so you have to work hard to come up with that value system that recognizes that future value.
I agree with you. But what you could do is you could say, and this is exactly what I would do. You could say, if we make these following decisions, what are the impacts going to be? Now, we make a decision, whatever it is. What are the impacts going to be over the next 10 or 20 years? And then you can say, okay, this decision will give us this set of impacts. This decision will give us this set of impacts. You try as many different decisions as you want, and then pick the one that best positions us for a 10 or 20-year future for our kids.
It's something I would say.
Is that responsive?
Yes, it's just, sometimes I think people work too hard on getting the probabilities right, thinking about all of the possible pathways, and not simply saying, well, what are we trying to achieve here?
Oh, no, I'm agreeing with you. I think that what you can start is you can start by saying, let's solve for
Right.
where the country's going to be for our grandchildren, in my case, grandchildren. And then you can do the process I just described. So I agree with you. Define your objectives.
As we sort of pass the mic around, something I would, on the list of things that I feel like I've really learned as we've been working together, I feel much more comfortable saying, yeah, there's just a judgment call involved. And I think it's interesting that that's really the framework. Ultimately, judgment calls still have to be made.
And that raises an interesting question about AI, I think, David, which is not in the book because we just came across too quickly. But if you make a decision, whatever it may be, and then you say, okay, I think you can have these 6 effects, and then what are the probabilities of each of these effects materializing? And then you can take 7 different decisions you could have made, make the best one. All these things ultimately are judgments. Nothing leaps off the page. It's all a matter of judgment. And some people have better judgment than others. What has struck me, I now take a tutorial in AI, and I do it twice a week with a terrific guy. It's 1 hour each time. And I've been doing it for 4 or 5 months. I don't know what time it is. And AI presumably, we could spend a lot of time on this, and I don't know much about it, so I would be quickly revealed to be quite ignorant, but nevertheless, I have learned something. I think AI could probably make these judgments better than a human being can. But that gets into a whole set of other questions that I'm not well equipped to. Well, I know something about it, not well equipped to discuss.
I have a quick question. What do you suggest the solution is to the fiscal problems? What specific actions need to be taken?
I don't think it's complicated. We can get out of this, but we can't solve it. But the politics are impossible. The Democrats say we have a terrible fiscal problem. Let's raise taxes. I don't think they're right. Republicans say we won't raise taxes. The Republicans say we have a terrible fiscal problem because of entitlements. We need to deal with entitlements. I think they're right, but we're not going to. So the Republicans say we won't raise taxes, but we have. From 2000 to 2022, okay, 22 years, the debt of roughly 45% of the increase in the debt was due to tax cuts. Interesting. So we have to raise taxes, but Republicans won't raise taxes, and we have to deal with entitlements. So Democrats won't deal with entitlements. And the sad thing, I think, sort of quasi-tragic thing for America, you could do both and have a very healthy economy. You really could. If you could just fix our healthcare system. Roughly speaking, we spend 18% or thereabouts of GDP on healthcare, and the rest of the developed world with roughly the same outcomes spends 10%. Well, that funnels through to Medicaid and Medicare, and that's an important part of our deficit. But the politics of changing our healthcare system. There was a good article recently, I actually not seen it, somebody sent it to me, about the role of insurance companies and all the intermediaries. You could deal with that, but you can't deal with it. Foundationally, I think the key to all of this in our country is the politics. Now, look, we may so screw things up, we'll get to a point where we really can't fix it without a crisis, but you couldn't have. But fixing it doesn't require intellect. This is not an intellectual problem at this point. I mean, there are a lot of substantive problems that are complicated, but it's a political problem.
I have a very primitive grasp of economics,
Me too.
but but I see a problem where long-term thinkers in positions of power are thinking about effects 10 and 20 years for policies. Politicians are thinking about getting elected in the short term. And I see this as a terrible problem in New York City, in industries I'm more familiar with, or real estate, or, you know, so how do we address that definite, you know, collision of goals and needs?
Margaret Thatcher once said that, exactly your point, Margaret Thatcher once said that she was doing the right thing for the long term. But politicians don't care about the long term.
Right.
They're not going to be in office for the long term.
Exactly.
They want to stay in office. No, it's your point. They want to be in office in the short term. Look, I think it's the fundamental, I think it's the foundational issue of our society. Marty Feldstein, late Marty Feldstein, who was a very highly respected conservative economist, and I think a terrific guy, very conservative. He once said to me, he died maybe 3 years ago, I don't remember, but he once said to me that if he, as a very conservative economist and a liberal economist, who were both willing to compromise and also were focused on facts and analysis and intellectual integrity, they can move forward on most of our issues. But it does take exactly what you said, which is a willingness to make decisions that are pain now, but benefit there. And that's the antithesis of what politicians want to do, because they want to get reelected tomorrow. So we've got to hope and pray that somehow they'll get back on the right track.
But I think in the book you talk about save Social Security first as an example of, if you want to just.
Well, that's a good point. There is also, of course, the art of trying to frame things so the long-term good can be made attractive politically. When we had very big tax revenues in 1997, I said to President Clinton, "Oh, this is terrific. Now we can pay down our debt." And he looked at me as if I was some little kid and said, "The Republicans are going to say lower taxes, and I'm going to go to the American people and say pay down our debt. It ain't going to work." But then John Hilley, who was our legislative affairs person, said, "You know, isn't there a way around this? We're not going to pay down the debt. We're going to save Social Security." It was total demagoguery, but it was terrific because people related to it, they believed it, and we in fact did exactly what we set out to do, which is improve our fiscal position. And we came out of the year 2000 with a terrific projected fiscal position. But then when the tax cuts went into effect, and the next year I guess it was, that undid the sort of relatively weak but nevertheless sufficient political I guess you call it consensus, it wasn't consensus, willingness to support fiscal discipline.
I guess that's where a president who can articulate a goal in a way that's palatable.
Well, that's what Clinton did, as well. I just described. On the other hand, he never made trade effective politically, and it was deeply frustrating to him. He could not find a way to express trade to the American people so that he could get support. Now, of course, we still did NAFTA and we did Chinese accession to WTO, neither of which you could do today. So we did better. But that's right. If you got a leader who could articulate this, it's a big step, but it's very hard to do because each of these people is running their own district and they're worried about getting elected. It's your point. They're worried about getting elected. It's really one of the great, maybe the single greatest actually, stress in a democratic system.
Could I ask you a question that has been bothering me? And that is that relations between the United States and China are perhaps rocky. And China owns a great deal of our government bonds. And I haven't kept up with the figures to see if they're continuing to purchase or if they have declined in the amount that they're purchasing. What effect would a further deterioration in our relations between China and the United States have on that situation?
I don't follow that particularly either, but I think I'm right when I'm about to say that their holdings have come down somewhat. But I think the issue of our relationship with China is much, much bigger than that. I thought so the answer to your question is, if we lost them as a buyer, that would be harmful. On the other hand, don't forget it's harmful to them too, because they own all these bonds. And having those bonds go down in price, interest rates go up, those bonds go down in price is not to their advantage either. So I don't think maybe I'm wrong, but I never thought that was a lever they would pull, and they haven't yet. It doesn't mean they won't. But I do think their holdings have gone down. But I think the issue of our relationship with China is massively important. I said once when I was interviewing the foreign minister, then foreign minister of China at the council, and I said the relationship between the United States and China are massively complex. One thing that's not complex is that relationship, whether for good or for bad, it's going to have tremendous effect on the 21st century, dealing with climate change, dealing with terrorism, dealing with nuclear weaponry, which I think is a much bigger threat than people realize, dealing now with the serious threats that AI can pose. So I think you're right about the importance of the issue. I don't know, look, if they ever decided to really unload their treasury bonds, that would not be good, but they certainly haven't done it so far. And well, I think our holdings will come down some.
We have 1 or 2 more questions, if that's good with you, so.
I'm here until breakfast.
I mentioned inequality and
Excuse me?
inequality, you spoke about that.
Yep.
And is there anything that you can imagine that would stem or change the trajectory of that in this country before we get to the let them eat cake stage? Because I think it is a very.
Well, let them eat cake or before people start appearing on the streets with spears.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
No, I know, yeah, it's a serious.
Yeah, I think.
And just as ancillary to that is the lack of public, discourse in our society as opposed to stated electronic opinions. Do you think those two have any relation?
Oh, yeah, I think if we could ever, funny we have this discussion at lunch or something, if we could ever get to the point where we establish public discourse and people would disagree and exchange views, but we are a million miles from there today, as you well know, and how we get from here to there. I had what I thought was a pretty good idea, but we got turned down.
What?
Well, when Stroke Talbot was head of the Brookings, we went to somebody, I won't say who it is, who was a pretty affluent guy. We said, if you'll take $1 billion of your money and fund it, at which point he said it was my money. I said, I understand that, but take $1 billion of your money and fund something. Rupert Murdoch lost $1 billion, not Rupert went to, but Rupert Murdoch lost $1 billion in trying to make textbooks accessible to kids. They weren't reading them. So he had the idea of turning them into games where they would interact with each other in a game-like mode. And then for a variety of reasons, after he spent about $1 billion on it, the unions basically undercut his efforts. It's a shame, because it probably was a good idea. We had the same idea. What if you used the social media not to try to tell people in some place or other why fiscal policy matters or whatever you want to call it, but rather to get them to interact. So it was in a game type of mode. It was a good idea, I think. I don't know. Anyway, we said $1 billion could get you started, and then you could go on from there. He said, "Well, that's okay, but my $1 billion, not yours. We're not going to do it." But I think public discourse is a very big deal.
There's some evidence that are anecdotal of very young people, maybe 12, 13, whatever, starting to go away from even TikTok and texting each other one-on-one. And it would take something like that to have a real change.
It would be, we have to move away from TikTok.
And move away from, yeah.
Yeah, and move towards something I was just describing.
Yes.
But adults too, if you can reach, the average working American and get people to really understand why it
I think
matters.
it's one of the.
Why it matters to have effective government and why you shouldn't be just supporting extremists whose views you agree with, but you should be supporting people who are committed to government. Yeah, you could deal with inequality if you had improved social safety nets, if you had an improved earned income tax credit, which goes to people who work but earn below a certain amount. So you improve that. You have some kind of social safety net that applies to people who really can't work. I was against welfare reform when President Clinton did it because I was afraid too many people would fall between the cracks. But basically, so I think I was right, by the way, as it turned out. But basically, have some kind of programs for people who do not work and then improve the earned income tax credit. Have better programs for effective job placement for people who get displaced by trade or technology. Gina Raimondo, when she was governor of Rhode Island, and I think it was General Dynamics, I believe, I'm not sure, but I think so, had a big plant and they were going to move it, shipbuilding plant of some kind. And she said to them, why? And they said, well, it's cheaper being someplace else. She said, what if I can create an effective workforce, train an effective workforce for you? They said, okay. So she got hold of the community colleges, and she worked with community colleges to develop not to develop programs that equip those people, graduates in college, to go right to general dynamics, they stay in the state. If we could do that nationally, and I just had much better, which we don't have, but all it takes, it really goes back to the thing I said, the foundational problem in our country is not each of these particular issues, because those are susceptible of intellectual inquiry, not inquiry. Those can be solved intellectually. Even if you disagree, okay, we disagree, but then you disagree on one thing, you try to go something else. It's our political system.
Question? Well, I'm gonna.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been extraordinary. I'm going to toss in one quick closing question, because I know that the people in this room probably read newspapers and want to keep up with good, reliable news, and well, not news, but opinion, thought, how to interpret news about the economy. Can you recommend a paper, a publication, a blog, a writer that we should follow? Or tell us who to stay away from. That's okay with me too.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's funny. I'm so engaged with so many people and stuff that I kind of, that's how I keep informed. And I hear people express their opinions and one thing. I think maybe I should say this because then I get in trouble with somebody else, but I think if I were going to pick any one paper to try to kind of both the news pages and the op-ed, probably the Washington Post, the editorial pages. I think they have less. I mean, Times is a wonderful newspaper. Anybody, I don't know, don't tell people, but it's a wonderful newspaper. But I'm sure. But I think the Washington Post is less affected by ideological positions than anybody else, and I think they're very good people.
And actually, do you mind if I ask follow-up on that? So in addition to the economic stuff, I think you talk about this notion of eclectic curiosity, and one of the ways that manifests itself is in your reading list. So other than the Yellow Path, which is on sale, where is it on sale?
Just outside.
Just outside. From which bookseller?
The corner bookstore.
The corner bookstore. What else are
It's a very
you?
good bookstore. I go there. Are you from there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So what else are you reading that you would recommend?
I'm almost finished with a book called 1919, which is have any of you read it? It's a remarkable book. It's about Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles, and all the and negotiations and the people who were involved and the consequences, David, of the decisions that were made. There's another book that probably nobody's ever heard of called Japan 1941. Have you heard of it? Yeah. I think I've read it twice. It's about the decisions that Japan made that led them up to Pearl Harbor. And it's a remarkable story about human nature. And by the way, Bill didn't do very beautiful. I mean, for example, I'm friendly with Henry Kissinger. I like him a lot. I find his stuff a little heavy. Not to be repeated, but they've said it before. Not much protection against that. But these are very readable. Henry's books are very thoughtful, by the way. I didn't mean to say that. But so that's two that I've just, one of my 1919 I've just about finished with, and Japan 1941, David, I've read it twice, and I just sort of finished that. Some other thing I was reading, what was it? Oh yeah, I apologize, I'm not remembering the author, but it's a book about European leaders, I guess it was 12 of them or something, in the interwar period and then beyond. But since I can't remember the name of the book or the name of the book.
Well, I think that's still two very good ones.
Yeah, we got two of them, two good ones.
Yeah.
Oh, and then bone fishing. No, seriously, there's a book, Bone Fishing, by a guy named Sonny Brown. That's quite good, actually, if you like bone fishing.
Thank you so much, Reverend.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for coming. Fun for me.